Plants are pruned and trained to ensure their health and vigor. Proper pruning is also an important mechanical IPM technique that can be used to prevent and manage pest problems. Always consider a plant's function and the reasons for pruning a plant before you begin making cuts.
No, so when we're starting to talk about pruning of landscape plants, there are some things you need to know before you actually take tools in hand and start cutting and start removing things. And the first thing I would advise everyone to know is, what is this plant's function in the landscape? Before you start pruning on it, you should be aware of what that function is, because part of your pruning is going to be to either enhance that function or to not take away from that function. The second thing is, most plants are best when they're healthy. And pruning is one of those things that, if done correctly, can really enhance a plant, and if it's done incorrectly, can really detract from the plant. And then the third thing is about the plant is, from your own perspective, is it's always best if you can have things as low maintenance as possible. And so if you prune incorrectly, in the long run, you can increase the amount of maintenance that you're going to have to do on this plant. There's lots of different reasons you can prune, but they tend to fall into certain categories. And probably the most common category for pruning is size control. There's something about the size of the plant that we need to adjust. Either we need to make the whole thing smaller, or we need to push it back so it doesn't spread as far. It's encroaching on a sidewalk, it's encroaching on a building. The second most common thing we prune for is probably just appearance, aesthetics, attractiveness. A lot of times people just want things pruned because they don't look so good. They're shabby looking. We can prune them and make them look neater and nicer.
Pruning is also done to mechanically remove diseased or infested wood. This can reduce the pest problem or sometimes even eliminate a pest. Pruning can prevent or reduce some foliar diseases by improving air circulation in the canopy, thus reducing the time moisture is on the leaves. Most fungal diseases require free moisture in order for the spores to germinate and infect.
Then we get into more specific things. We prune street trees for pedestrian clearance so that people don't hit their heads as they're walking under them. Visibility is a big thing. Street signs, intersections is another reason you prune street trees. Visibility and views, that's some of the worst pruning that happens, is because we prune trees without thinking about the proper pruning of the tree. We're thinking about the view. There are more detailed things that we do to encourage plants to sort of reinvigorate them. A plant that is overgrown may not flower very well anymore, and so we might prune a big overgrown plant to encourage more flowering or fruiting. Sometimes a plant is casting too much shade, and we want to thin it out and open it up and allow more light penetration. Sometimes it's just the opposite. Sometimes we want the plant to screen a view, and so we might prune it back to encourage side branching to make it more dense, so that we are screening either an unsightly view or just gaining ourselves more privacy. Damage, storm damage or accident damage, there are pruning things that we can do so that the plant can sort of repair itself better. And they don't really heal, but they do deal with their wounds and injuries and stuff that they get from branch breakages or impacts from vehicles. You might have a flowering plant that you want more flowers off of, and you can prune to influence flowering. Same with fruit. You can prune to influence gaining more fruit off of your plant, whether that's an apple tree for edible fruit or a pyracantha bush that you're just looking at the berries and you just want more and more berries off of them. The opposite of that is the fruit might be a nuisance, and you can prune to discourage fruit as much as possible.
All plants are not alike. They have varying cultural requirements, growth habits, and disease and insect susceptibilities. It's important to know about the requirements of the plants that you prune so that you can achieve your pruning objectives.
We should be able to identify what the plant is. We should know what it is we're working on because all plants are different. They have different attributes and characteristics, and so one size does not fit all when it comes to pruning. So it's nice to know what the name of the plant is. For instance, a flowering cherry. It's nice to know what its genus and species is. And then after you know and can identify what the plant is, then understanding what its growth habit is. I chose flowering cherry as an example because there's numerous types of growth habits. There are columnar flowering cherries. There are vase-shaped flowering cherries. There are round crowned cherries that are equally wide as they are tall. There are weeping flowering cherries. So understanding what you're working with is going to help you achieve your objective. And then lastly, it's nice to know what a good specimen looks like. And you prune with an idea, a picture in your mind of what this should look like when I'm finished. And this means looking at a mature specimen, not a 5-foot tall, 10-gallon pot in a nursery. You should be able to look at a mature specimen that's relatively full grown and that is performing its function in the landscape.
When you're doing routine pruning, it's important to remove dead, damaged, decayed, and diseased wood. This will help keep your plants healthy, and when done correctly, the plant has a better chance of recovering from damage or disease.
This is how I approach a plant when I'm going to prune it. And it's easiest to work from the basics. Make the easiest decisions first, clean up your plant as you go along. The more difficult decisions become easier as you get rid of the extraneous stuff. Extraneous stuff starts with dead wood. You can never go wrong getting rid of the dead wood. So start with dead wood, clean up your plant, get as much of the dead tissue out as possible. From there, look at other branches which aren't as healthy. So we refer to these as the other D wood, the damaged wood, the decayed wood, the diseased wood, branches which have old injuries on them, which have decay in them, perhaps a live canker that's active. Those are all good things to get rid of. So once we get rid of the D wood, we've cleaned things up quite a bit. Now it gets a little bit more difficult. But another basic is the crossing and rubbing branches. Branches that rub together, that move in the wind, remove bark. Removal of bark becomes an injury, becomes a pathogen, disease entry point. Crossing and rubbing branches are a problem, so we need to remove them. Now, if they are not injured, you only need to remove one of those two rubbing branches. If they're both injured, then sometimes you remove them both. So you've gotten rid of the dead, the diseased, dying, decayed. You've gotten rid of crossing and rubbing branches. Then start looking at inward growing branches. You want most things to radiate out from the center. That's the natural growth habit of most plants. Things which grow back in towards the interior usually become crossing and rubbing. Now we're looking at just crowded areas. Areas where there's branches which don't have any defects, but there's too many of them. We need to get rid of a few branches because it's too crowded in this area, because as they put on side branches, we get crossing and rubbing branches. We don't want to spend our whole career pruning this plant, getting rid of crossing and rubbing branches. If we can thin out a few main branches and open it up and allow the side branches to grow properly and fill the space adequately. Once we get past the crowded branches, then you're going to start looking for some other defects in the plant. The first one is a major structural problem, and that is codominant stems. Codominant stems are two trunks or two stems on a bush which are competing to be the leader. If they have a very tight union, and the union is referred to as a crotch, if it's a narrow crotch, a V-shaped crotch like that, as each of these trunks or stems puts on a ring of wood, they're going to overgrow that branch bark ridge, and they're going to sort of squish together. And that's going to have bark up against bark. And so this is a structural weak point. We often see large trees splitting at these narrow forks, these narrow crotches. Sometimes there's still things that need to be done on the plant, and that's because there's these non-conforming branches that maybe we didn't recognize to begin with. These are things which don't fit the character of the plant. either from a growth habit standpoint or just aesthetics. And then there's one more thing we can look at. And one of the big problems we wind up with these days with nursery grown trees, particularly ones which were containerized, is sometimes we get circling and girdling roots. And if you can identify something like this, then cutting that root, removing it, or at least cutting it in half so it relieves the pressure of it and the trunk can continue to expand is really beneficial to the tree.
There are many different reasons to prune plants. But fundamentally, pruning is to make sure that the plants we maintain are as healthy and structurally strong as possible. Pruning is an important IPM tool to prevent and manage many of the insect and disease problems in Pacific Northwest ornamental plants.
Pruning is one technique that can be used in IPM management for plant problems. Some of the reasons that you prune is to remove disease that's present in plants. You can look for insect infestations and decrease that, and you can deal with stress from abiotic sources. Plants need foliage in order to survive and even thrive in the landscape. Proper pruning allows there to be enough foliage left on the plant so that it can continue to photosynthesize and make food. Improper pruning can actually increase stress on a plant, remove too much foliage, and increase pest and disease problems. You want to make the smallest wounds that you can when you're making pruning cuts so that they don't leave large wounds that are more susceptible to decay pathogens. Pruning out dead and diseased branches is a good way to stop the spread of disease pathogens in landscape plants. For example, it's always good to remove dead leaves, flowers, and small branches infected with anthracnose in dogwood trees to reduce the load of the pathogen in the tree. Another plant that benefits from selective removal of diseased branches is evergreen huckleberry, which suffers from witch's broom rust. Regularly removing branches that are infected, especially young branches, maintains the health of the plant and prevents it from getting so overloaded with the rust pathogen. Junipers are a commonly planted landscape plant. The lower spreading forms are very susceptible to juniper blight, a fungal disease. When possible, prune out the branches that have the fungal blight to increase air circulation and decrease the spread of the pathogen. Sometimes cane-growing or ground cover shrubs can be coppiced to the ground in dormancy in order to remove infected plant material. The result will be regrowth in the spring that is uninfected. For example, salal often gets infected with fungal leaf spot or sometimes infested with thrips. When pruning this in the wintertime, you can remove that infested or infected material and new foliage comes up that is free of that infection or infestation. Branches with cankers also benefit from pruning. It is generally best to prune beyond the canker into healthy wood. Madrona trees are susceptible to a number of cankers caused by fungi. It is always best to try to catch these cankers when they are small and on smaller branches, because madronas will do much better if the cankers are not allowed to enlarge. It's good IPM practice to remove insect webbing and egg masses when you notice them on branches. Always better when they're smaller, and if possible to remove them before the insects hatch and can do more damage to your plants. For example, tent caterpillars that are removed when the webs are quite small don't do the damage to the foliage that you would see if you let them get bigger. Some insects, like root weevils, move from the ground up into the lower branches of plants. It's always helpful to remove some of those lower branches to reduce damage. Pruning to reduce density in the canopy of trees and shrubs is a great way to increase light into the interior of the plant to decrease the dieback from shading for those interior branches. It also increases the air circulation in the canopy of that plant, which will decrease moisture and allow foliage to dry off and not be as susceptible to fungal and bacterial infections. Plants that can benefit from this type of pruning include maples and lilacs that suffer from bacterial blight, as well as flowering cherries and plums, which suffer from a number of fungal diseases. Regardless of why you're pruning, it's always important to follow best management practices and the standards that are currently being used. It's never good to do poor pruning or inappropriate pruning because that actually increases pest and disease problems and can increase the stress on a plant to where they're more susceptible to pest and disease infestations. One example of poor pruning is topping trees. Topping trees to try to make them smaller generally doesn't work and makes fairly large wounds in older branches and trunks that are much more susceptible to decay pathogens. Topping won't only affect a tree's health, but can also affect the structural integrity and safety of that plant. Overskirting is another example of poor pruning. This is when you remove too many lower branches to lift the bottom of a tree or a shrub up. If you remove too much of a plant's canopy, it will be unable to photosynthesize and make enough food to support itself. In general, it is important not to lift a tree up more than 1/3 the height of its total canopy. Overthinning is just what it sounds like. In an attempt to reduce density, you may be making good pruning cuts, but you're actually removing too much live material. If you do that kind of pruning during times of drought stress, it will actually make a plant less drought tolerant, increase their stress and their susceptibility to disease and insect problems. It's especially important not to remove too many of the inner leaves or inner stems because those leaves are responsible for photosynthesis and making food for plants, especially during periods of high heat and low water. Another problem with overthinning is that it can force a plant to respond with excessive sprouting or suckering in order to replace the missing tissue. Overshearing is seen all the time and is a pruning practice that can actually increase pest and disease problems as well as create excessive stress on otherwise healthy plants. A good example of this would be boxwoods. Boxwoods are often oversheared and have started to develop problems with boxwood blight and boxwood canker to the point at which they're actually failing. Another plant that gets oversheared regularly is Photinia. Photinia does not respond well to overshearing and in fact increases fungal leaf spot problems and from the stress of the shearing has developed a physiological leaf spot as well. When you prune is actually quite important because of how the plant responds to the pruning. Dormant pruning encourages plant growth due to the fact that the plant is filled with food that has been stored from the previous season. Summer pruning is a time when growth is actually inhibited, so that when you remove growth, you will not get as much of a response. Some of the advantages of dormant pruning are that you're able to look at the structure of a plant to see if there has been any disease damage, any insect or pest damage, and you can also look for signs such as egg masses on bare stems. Another good advantage of dormant pruning is that you're able to see if a plant is under stress. You can look at how much it has grown in the previous years, whether or not there's been dieback, excessive dieback especially, and if there has, if that was caused by any disease problems. It's also beneficial to do your renovation pruning during dormancy because you will get the best response when you do remove the tissue that you didn't want. Some of the disadvantages of doing dormant pruning, especially in the maritime Pacific Northwest, is that our winters can be somewhat temperate and wet, and that actually increases the spread of fungal and bacterial diseases into newly pruned wounds. Another problem with pruning for foliar diseases is that you can't see them during the dormant season. One of the best reasons to prune in the summer is that it tends to be drier, and that decreases any spread that you might be doing while you prune of fungus and bacterial diseases. Another great reason to prune in the summer is that you're able to see any new disease infections as well as new infestations of insects, and it's a good time to be monitoring for any insect issues. There are a couple of disadvantages to pruning in summer. One of the disadvantages is that many plants are drought stressed in the summer from the heat and lack of water, and are more susceptible actually to infection from diseases and being attacked by insects when they are under stress. There are a number of adult insects that are flying during the summer. They are attracted to pruning cuts, or any wound for that matter, and will actually enter the plant to lay eggs and increase the infestation at that time. It's always difficult to determine exactly when you should prune a tree, or any plant for that matter, especially if they have a number of issues with pests and diseases. For example, flowering cherries are prone to a fungal disease called blossom brown rot, bacterial disease called bacterial canker, and are often hit by an insect called the cherry bark tortrix. It's important to determine which of the problems might actually kill the tree if you prune at the wrong time. In the case of the cherry, while it is nice to prune in drier seasons in order to avoid spreading the fungal and bacterial diseases, they don't tend to kill the tree. The cherry bark tortrix, on the other hand, can kill the tree. A good compromise is to prune in September when the adults have stopped flying and it is still somewhat dry in the area. It's important not to underestimate the role that stress plays on plant health. A tree or a shrub that is under stress is going to be much more susceptible to insect or disease problems. Removing too much live wood, especially during dry and hot periods, will increase stress substantially in most plants. Improper pruning that results in a number of stub cuts or wounds down trunks allows for infections to enter with decay pathogens, including a number of canker diseases. Perhaps the most common poor pruning practice that we see is overshearing of shrubs. So what do we do when we see shrubs that have been sheared severely over time, that are suffering from environmental stress and or suffering from severe pest or disease problems? How do we deal with shrubs that have been oversheared? One of the things that we can do is renovate them. We can either do a fast renovation where we cut them to the ground in dormancy and allow them to regrow, or we can do a slower renovation where we selectively reduce and remove branches in order to reform the plant's natural structure.
Always use appropriate pruning cuts to achieve the results you desire. You also need to know how the plant will respond to each type of pruning cut. If inappropriate pruning cuts are made, they can compromise the health of the plant and cause structural weakness.
With the 2017 update of the ANSI A300 pruning standard, there are 4 distinct types of pruning cuts that are identified. There's the branch removal cut, a reduction cut, a heading cut, and shearing. The branch removal cut is made at the point of attachment to the main trunk or main stem that the branch being removed is attached to. This cut is made at a structure particularly found on trees. It's called the branch collar, and that's a sort of a swollen area where there's at the juncture of the main trunk and the branch. Reduction cut is when the long section is removed, and so we're making a cut at a location where there's a lateral branch that can become the new leader, and we're removing the larger piece that was above it. And for it to be a good reduction cut, the lateral branch you cut back to needs to be somewhere around at least 1/3 of the diameter of the part that was removed. If it's too small, then that remaining branch won't have the vigor and the strength to take over being the new leader for that stem. So some people may be familiar with that kind of cut referred to as cutting back to a lateral, or drop crotch cut, or even selective heading. But what we now want to call this cut is a reduction cut, which does what its name says. We use it to reduce the length or the width of a branch. So this may be used to manage size. It can also be used to reduce the branch density on a very long branch that may have a lot of end weight to it. We can use a reduction cut to lighten up that end of the branch and maintain its natural form. Heading cuts are used to remove the end of a branch or a main trunk. Those cuts are made sometimes to a node where there's existing buds. If there's a branch that's less than 1/3 the diameter of the main stem, that's also considered a heading cut. And sometimes heading cuts are just random, that are between nodes and branch locations. When a heading cut is made to a larger diameter stem, particularly when we think about the main trunk of a tree, that's then called a topping cut. And topping cuts tend to be unproductive for tree pruning, especially. It's considered inappropriate pruning and is not recommended for trees in general. What happens with the topping cut is you end up with a lot of new shoot growth that's weakly attached at that near the cut end. There's opportunities for decay to enter that main trunk, which further results in weakened structure. And then the next thing that will happen is you've got such dense branch growth that now we have a greater susceptibility to issues with insect and foliar blights from the overcrowding of the branches. On smaller plants, heading cuts may be helpful to promote branching that might be used in training a particular plant. So heading cuts typically made with a hand pruner. Topping cuts, we're looking at that larger diameter, generally probably done with a saw. Neither of those cuts are generally effective at reducing size because you're going to have new growth that's going to extend from the area where those cuts were made. So shearing cuts are those that are made with shears, either hand shears or power head shears. And shearing is when we're cutting to an even plane, and the cuts are made through both the small stems and leaves. The typical place for applying shearing is for specialized training such as hedges or topiary. Sometimes shearing crosses over and might be used in general practice, and it can lead to some issues for those plants that may not be tolerant to that type of shearing, or maybe that are sheared with too great a frequency that can result in plant stress and associated pest problems. Really important to remember is that in general, shearing, rounding over of trees is inappropriate. It can lead to long-term structural and health problems. So shearing should be avoided on trees. It certainly has a place and is the important cut to use when we're training hedges and topiary and other specialized plant forms. So each time we make a pruning cut on a tree or shrub, we're creating a wound. Each pruning cut is a wound that that plant needs to respond to. There's a saying, trees don't heal, they seal. So wherever there's a pruning cut that's made, what the plant will do is grow new wood over that old wound, and that wound will always be there within the growth rings of the branches and the stems. When you remove a branch from a tree and we're making that cut at the branch collar, that swollen raised area of the trunk, it's got additional stored energy and protective compounds that help diminish the opportunity for decay to enter that area. So trees kind of have their own built-in wound dressing. We don't want to paint or put anything on the surface of that wound. What we want to do is just make a really well-placed, clean collar cut. Once that's done, the area around that wound is going to develop new wood, often called callus, but it's basically new wood that's going to grow around that pruning wound and cover it up and seal it off from exposure to the elements. On the inside, there's going to be protective zones that are set up around that wound to essentially wall it off so that it will contain that injured area in a discrete location and keep it from spreading within the wood. So that process of walling off the wound, those interior zones of protection and the wound wood that grows around the cut, that process is referred to as compartmentalization. And it's basically describing the way the wounded area is contained and within a small area of wood. Maintaining that compartmentalization takes energy. So we want to be thoughtful about how many cuts we make, and especially how many large cuts we make on a main trunk of a tree so that we don't cause too much stress or reduce the amount of functional wood for other growth processes. The 2017 ANSI pruning standards identify a group of practices that are considered generally inappropriate pruning practices, particularly in relationship to trees. And that would be topping of trees, over-thinning of the tree canopy, lion tailing, which is the process of removing interior branches and then leaving dense, heavier branch growth on the end of a limb, making flush cuts, which totally removes that branch collar and that interrupts the ability for good compartmentalization to occur. We can have greater decay, and it also makes a much larger wound on the main trunk. And then leaving stubs is also a bad practice because the new wound wood can't grow around to seal the wound, and that old stub, as it dies back, becomes an opportunity for decay to enter into the trunk.
Specific types of pruning are recommended for young trees. It's best to correct structural deficiencies while trees are young, when you can make small cuts rather than needing to make large cuts later. Young trees that are trained are more likely to grow to be strong and healthy mature trees.
Pruning of young trees for their future structure and strength is really a great investment in not only promoting good structure, but also protecting the future health of our young trees. And this aspect of pruning is often overlooked. There are many benefits to pruning trees when they're young for good structure. One is that we're making a few small cuts that would avoid the need for pruning in the future that may result in making very large wounds on the main trunk, which if we make a cut on a main trunk that's like, a third of the diameter of that trunk or thereabouts, typically those kinds of wounds aren't able to close over in a timely fashion to reduce the potential of decay entering. So with a young tree, we remove some of those branches while they're small. We've eliminated the need to prune them in the future, and we've helped maintain the vigor and strength of that tree as it matures. The other thing that we accomplish with training young trees is we can establish a good branch structure for good spacing, which would then promote better canopy health in terms of the potential, which is significant for some species, of getting leaf blights or certain leaf insect infestations. In general, training a tree when it's young for good vigor as it grows older will reduce the overall stress factor that could contribute to secondary pest issues. There are 5 basic steps to keep in mind when we're training a young tree. The first thing is to look it over and see if there are any dead or broken branches on the tree. And we'll take care of those first. The next step is to look and see if it has one strong central leader. And if there isn't, if you have a double leader, we want to correct that. Ideally, we can correct it sort of hand pruner size cut where we're removing one of those leaders at the point of attachment. If that double leader has gotten sort of much larger in diameter, then it's often better to do a really strong reduction cut on one of those leaders to suppress its growth, and then the energy will go into the second leader that was left unpruned.
If not corrected early, double leaders often develop included bark between the two stems. This weak branch structure is prone to breakage in storm or strong wind events.
The third step is to figure out where the lowest permanent branch should be of that canopy based on its location. From there, we would look at what the branch height is of the tree. So very often, that lowest permanent branch could be close to the total height of the tree. So we're not going to be able to do that limbing up all in one visit. We want to keep an overall height of branch area that is 2/3 the total height of the tree. So if you have branches that are within that 2/3 for that young tree, but eventually need to go away, we might shorten them to suppress their growth, but still keep some branches and leaf area, which is going to support building strong trunk taper. And the other benefit of shortening those temporary branches is that when we do come back to remove them, it'll be a smaller diameter wound because they won't have grown at the same rate as an unpruned branch. So then each year that you come back as a tree grows taller, you can start removing those lower branches until you reach the appropriate canopy height. The next step would be then to look at the distance between each of the main lateral limbs. Where is the best position for those large scaffold limbs? And we want to make sure that they're not so close together that they might rub or impede each other's development. So we want them well spaced. The larger growing the tree, the greater distance you need between those permanent scaffold limbs. And then finally, you want to look to see that those scaffold limbs are well distributed around the tree. So you don't want large scaffold limbs all at the same height, but spread out spirally over the length of the trunk.
In summary, there are 5 key things to look for during the first years of establishment of young trees: dead or broken branches, a strong single central leader, the location for the lowest permanent branches, the gradual removal or reduction of any temporary branches below the lowest permanent branch height, and good spacing between scaffold branches so they won't be overcrowded as the tree matures. Attention to these details while trees are still small pays off in promoting future tree health and strength and in reducing long-term pruning demands.
So another consideration for structural pruning of young trees is what you do at the time of planting. So in general, we don't want to do overall pruning of that canopy area at the time of planting, because when you do that, you're taking away photosynthate potential. You're taking away leaf area that is going to literally feed root development. That said, if at the time of planting you have broken branches or you see dead branches, those are totally appropriate to take care of. And then secondly, if you find that you've got a double leader and you can, with a hand pruner or a small cut, remove one of those double leaders or correct that leader so that you have one central leader, that would be an appropriate dosage of pruning to do at the time of planting. Otherwise, if those things aren't present or you do them, you're going to wait till the second year in the ground to continue the process of the 5 steps of training young trees. And then you will revisit the tree over the next few years to continue that process. And then generally, once you've reached that point, that tree is set up to not need significant levels of pruning as it matures.